A millionaire decided to test his poor girlfriend by saying his company had gone bankrupt. And what happened next? Ethan Carter stood on the balcony of his Manhattan penthouse, the city lights shimmering below like a sea of stars. From this height, he could see everything. Skyscrapers piercing the night sky, yellow cabs weaving through busy streets, and crowds of people chasing dreams. Yet, despite his wealth and the world seemingly at his feet, he felt empty. For someone who had everything, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing, or rather, that someone could take it all away. Trust. That was the issue. After years of betrayals, shallow relationships, and gold diggers who only saw him as a walking bank account, Ethan had learned to approach love with suspicion. People only stayed around when the money flowed, and when it didn't, well, he had seen what happened. Emma Monroe, however, had been different. She wasn't like the women from his world, the ones who flaunted designer bags and judged others by the cut of their suits. He had met Emma 6 months ago at a small diner in Brooklyn, where she worked as a waitress. Her auburn hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her uniform was worn from use, but her smile, that was radiant. Ethan had gone in for a quick coffee after a stressful day, needing a break from endless meetings and corporate games. Emma had greeted him warmly, her voice cheerful as she juggled orders and apologized for the wait. It wasn't just her beauty that drew him in, it was her authenticity. Emma listened when he spoke. She laughed at his dry jokes, even when he thought they weren't funny. Over time, their conversations became deeper, and Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone else. But now, 6 months into their relationship, doubts crept in. Was Emma too good to be true? Could she really love him for who he was, or would her feelings change if the money disappeared? The question gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night. Ethan knew he couldn't live with the uncertainty. If he wanted a future with Emma, he needed to be sure of her intentions. The idea that had been forming in the back of his mind for weeks finally crystallized. He would test her. The plan began to take shape during dinner at Emma's favorite Italian restaurant. It wasn't a 5-star establishment. It was a cozy, family-run spot in Queens where the smell of garlic and freshly baked bread filled the air. The dim lighting cast a warm glow on Emma's face as she twirled spaghetti around her fork, completely unaware of the storm brewing in Ethan's mind. "Emma," Ethan began, his tone heavy with fake exhaustion, "I need to tell you something." She looked up, concern immediately washing over her features. "Oh, what's wrong? Are you okay?" He hesitated, guilt flickering in his chest. I've lost everything." Her fork clattered against her plate as her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I made a bad investment," he said, spinning his fabricated tale. "I trusted the wrong people, and now everything's gone. The company, the money. I don't even have enough to cover next month's bills." He dropped his gaze to his plate, feigning shame. For a moment, Emma said nothing, and Ethan felt a pang of fear. Had she already started calculating an exit? Would she leave him like so many others had? But then Emma reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm, steady. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "You're not alone in this." Ethan looked up, startled by her calm response. "You're not upset?" "Of course I'm upset," she admitted, "but not because of the money. I'm upset because you're hurting." She squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. "I love you, Ethan. We'll get through this together." Ethan's heart twisted as he replayed her words later that night. She had said everything he wanted to hear, but he couldn't let go of his doubts just yet. Words were easy, actions spoke louder. The next morning, he packed a bag and left his penthouse for a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. He told Emma he needed to downsize and start fresh. To his surprise, she showed up with a bag of groceries and a smile. "I figured you'd need some essentials," she said, unloading cans of soup and a loaf of bread onto his tiny kitchen counter. "And I made some calls. A friend of mine knows a guy who's hiring at his hardware store. It's not glamorous, but it's something." Ethan stared at her, speechless. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Tears, complaints, maybe even anger. But Emma didn't seem fazed by the sudden change in their circumstances. As the days passed, she continued to surprise him. She cooked simple meals in his cramped kitchen, brought over blankets to make the apartment feel cozier, and even offered to lend him money from her savings. At first, Ethan refused. "You've been saving for years," he protested. "It's just money," she said, brushing off his concerns. "What matters is that you're okay." Ethan's guilt deepened with every selfless act. He found himself questioning whether this test was even fair, but his resolve to see it through remained. He had to be sure. Little did he know, the biggest revelation was just around the corner. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the kitchen counter. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of the tiny Brooklyn apartment, a far cry from the blackout shades in his penthouse. He sighed, silencing the call. Another message from his financial advisor, one of dozens he'd been ignoring. For now, the world could wait. Emma arrived shortly after, with a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery down the street. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose braid, and she wore a denim jacket over her waitress uniform. She was glowing in a way that Ethan couldn't comprehend. How could someone working 2 jobs, saving every penny, and now helping him radiate so much joy? "I thought you could use some real coffee," Emma said, setting the bag on the counter. "You didn't have to do this," Ethan murmured. "Of course I did." She waved him off and began unpacking the pastries. "You've been through a lot. You need to keep your energy up." Her warmth was disarming, but Ethan couldn't shake the unease in his chest. He was beginning to feel like the villain in his own story. He had walked into this test, expecting to confirm his worst fears, but instead, Emma was challenging everything he believed. Later that evening, Emma invited him over to her apartment for dinner. It was a modest space in Queens, filled with second-hand furniture and personal touches that made it feel like home. A small photo of her parents sat on the bookshelf, their smiles warm and proud. During dinner, Ethan learned more about Emma's life. Her parents were immigrants who had worked tirelessly to provide for her and her siblings. Emma had grown up watching them struggle, but they never complained. They had always dreamed of owning a house, a real home where they could retire comfortably. It was a dream Emma had taken on as her own. "I've been saving for years," she admitted, a soft smile on her lips. "I'm so close now, just a little more, and I can finally surprise them." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. She'd been saving for something so selfless, so pure, and here he was, lying to her. After dinner, while Emma was in the kitchen washing dishes, Ethan noticed a small safe tucked away in the corner of her living room. It was hidden behind a stack of books, almost out of sight. His curiosity got the better of him. "Emma," he called, "is that your savings?" She poked her head out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "Yeah, it's safer than keeping it in the bank. My parents don't trust banks, and I guess that rubbed off on me." Ethan nodded, the weight of her trust pressing down on him. She had worked so hard, scrimped and saved every dollar, and here she was offering to give it all up for him. A week later, the moment came. Ethan had been struggling to keep up his charade, but Emma was as supportive as ever. She brought him lunch at his new job, helped him go through mock listings for cheaper apartments, and never once complained. Then, one evening, as they sat on the couch in his dimly lit apartment, Emma took a deep breath. "Ethan," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking, I want to help." "You already have," he said quickly. "You've done more than enough." "No, she interrupted, her tone firm. I mean, really help. I've been saving for my parents, but they'd want me to do this. You need it more right now. Ethan's heart stopped. Emma, no. That's your dream. I can't let you do that. It's not about the money, she said, reaching for his hand. It's about us. If you're in this together with someone, you don't keep score. You just give. Ethan stared at her, his chest tight. He didn't know whether to cry or confess everything on the spot. She had passed his test with flying colors, but it didn't feel like a victory. Instead, he felt like a fraud. That night, after Emma left, Ethan sat alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Her selflessness was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who calculated every move, every relationship, and every favor. But Emma? She gave without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. He thought about the safe in her apartment, the years of sacrifice it represented. If she had no problem giving it all up for him, what did that say about him? Was he truly incapable of trust? The lines of his plan were blurring. What had started as a test for Emma was quickly becoming a test for himself, and he wasn't sure he was passing. Emma's generosity had shaken Ethan to his core. But the lie he was living was becoming harder to maintain. Little did he know, the truth was closer to unraveling than he expected. The days following Emma's offer were an emotional whirlwind for Ethan. Her selflessness haunted him, and his guilt grew heavier with every moment they spent together. He was torn between ending the charade and clinging to it for a little longer. How could he risk losing her trust after everything she'd proven? But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's hidden. One Friday evening, Ethan arrived at Emma's apartment for dinner. She had mentioned earlier that her parents were visiting over the weekend, and the excitement in her voice was unmistakable. She wanted everything to be perfect. Another glimpse into her kind, family-oriented nature. "Hey, come in!" Emma greeted him at the door, her cheeks flushed from cooking. The smell of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread wafted into the hallway. Ethan smiled, but his stomach churned. He knew he was running out of time. As Emma returned to the kitchen to finish preparing the meal, Ethan set his jacket on the couch and glanced around the apartment. His eyes landed on her small desk in the corner. It was cluttered with notebooks, pens, and a small stack of unopened envelopes. One envelope caught his attention. His name was printed on the front. Frowning, Ethan walked over and picked it up. It was from his lawyer's office, a packet that must have slipped through during one of their recent meetings. He had completely forgotten about it. The weight of dread settled in his chest. How did it end up here? "Ethan, can you grab the plates from the cabinet?" Emma called from the kitchen. "Sure," he replied, sliding the envelope into his pocket. But it was too late. Emma emerged from the kitchen and froze when she saw the look on his face. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the edge of the envelope peeking out of his pocket. Ethan hesitated, trying to come up with a quick explanation, but Emma's expression hardened. "Ethan," she said firmly, "what's going on?" Under her questioning gaze, Ethan faltered. "It's nothing, Emma, just some old paperwork." But Emma wasn't convinced. "Why would it have your name on it and come here? That doesn't make sense." She reached for the envelope, and Ethan instinctively stepped back. The motion made her pause, hurt flashing in her eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" she demanded. Ethan knew the lie had run its course. He couldn't continue hurting her this way, not after everything she had sacrificed, everything she had offered. His heart pounded as he searched for the right words, but there was no easy way to say it. "Emma," he exhaled shakily, "I lied to you." Her brows furrowed. "About what?" "About everything." He pulled out the envelope and placed it on the table between them. "I didn't lose my money. I'm not broke. His voice cracked. "I made it up because I needed to know if you loved me for who I am or what I have." The room fell silent. Emma stared at him, her face unreadable, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "So," she said finally, her voice low, "this whole time, you've been testing me?" "Emma, you made me believe you were struggling. You let me think." Her voice broke and she took a step back. "You let me offer to give up everything I've been saving for my parents. For you." Ethan's chest tightened. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I've been hurt before, and I didn't know how else to stop." Emma held up her hand, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't get to justify this. You don't get to treat me like some experiment and then act like it's okay because you're sorry." "Emma, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You mean everything to me. I just didn't know how to trust. I was scared." Emma shook her head, wiping away a tear. "You didn't trust me, Ethan. That's the problem. You didn't even give me the chance to prove myself before deciding I needed to be tested." The weight of her words crushed him. She was right. He hadn't trusted her, not fully. Emma turned away, wrapping her arms around herself, as if shielding her heart. "You said you loved me, but love doesn't look like this. Love isn't a game, Ethan." "I know," he whispered. "I know I messed up. But I swear, Emma, I've never felt this way about anyone. You've shown me more kindness, more love than I've ever known. And I've been too much of a coward to trust it, to trust you." She stood silent for a long moment before turning back to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. "I need time, Ethan. I can't do this right now. I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again." He nodded, his heart shattering into pieces. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." Ethan left the apartment that night feeling emptier than he ever had. For the first time in years, he didn't care about his wealth, his status, or his reputation. The only thing that mattered was Emma, and he had pushed her away. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had to find a way to make things right, to show her that his love was real. As he walked through the quiet streets of Queens, an idea began to form. It wouldn't undo the damage he had caused, but it might be a start. Ethan spent the following days in a haze of regret. He couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, and every quiet moment brought him back to the look in Emma's eyes, the pain, the betrayal. He hated himself for being the cause of it. Emma had gone silent. She didn't return his calls or respond to his texts. Each unanswered message was a reminder of just how badly he had hurt her. But Ethan wasn't going to let this end here. He needed to prove to her, not just with words, but with actions, that he was willing to change. One evening, Ethan sat in his penthouse, back in the world he had pretended to leave behind. For the first time, he looked around and saw how hollow it all felt. The designer furniture, the sprawling view of the city, it was meaningless without Emma. He pulled out his laptop and began researching. He remembered Emma talking about her parents' dream of owning a house, a place they could finally call home. She had sacrificed so much to save for it, and he had nearly taken that dream from her. Ethan decided he would give them that dream, no matter what it cost. The next week, Ethan worked tirelessly with real estate agents to find the perfect home. It couldn't be flashy or over the top. It had to feel right. Modest, warm, and full of potential, just like Emma's family. After days of searching, he found it. A charming 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood in Queens. It had a small front porch, a yard big enough for a garden, and even the white picket fence Emma's mother had always dreamed of. But Ethan didn't stop there. He paid off the mortgage in full, made arrangements for renovations to fix anything that needed repair, and ensured everything was set for the family to move in immediately. When the paperwork was finalized, Ethan hesitated. Should he tell Emma what he had done? Would it even matter? He feared she might see it as another manipulation, another attempt to control the narrative. So instead, He did it anonymously. He left a letter in Emma's mailbox explaining that the house was a gift from someone who wanted to see her family happy. He didn't sign his name. A few days later, Emma called him. Ethan's heart raced when he saw her name flash on his phone. He answered immediately. "Emma?" Her voice was soft, cautious. "Did you do this?" He froze. "Do what?" "The house," she said, her tone trembling. "My parents got the deed today. They said someone bought it for them outright. Was it you?" Ethan took a deep breath. He couldn't lie to her anymore. "Yes," he admitted. "It was me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally. "I didn't want you to think it was some grand gesture to win you back," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, because I saw how much it meant to you, and I wanted to make that dream come true for you and your family." Emma was quiet again, and Ethan's heart pounded in the silence. "Can we talk?" she asked at last. "Of course," he said immediately. They met at a park near her apartment, a quiet spot with benches under a canopy of oak trees. Emma sat down first, and Ethan joined her, careful to keep some distance. "I don't know what to say," Emma began, her voice steady but hesitant. "When I found out about the house, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was angry, because it felt like you were trying to fix things with money." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop him. "But then I realized this wasn't about you, it was about my parents. You did something incredible for them, something I never could have done on my own, and that means something to me." Ethan swallowed hard. "Emma, I know I can't undo the damage I've done. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better for you, for us." Emma looked at him, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "I can see that," she said quietly. "Does that mean—" He started, hope rising in his chest. "It means I'm not ready to jump back into things," she said, cutting him off gently. "But I'm willing to take it one step at a time. You hurt me, Ethan. Trust doesn't come back overnight." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "I understand. I'll wait as long as it takes." Over the next few weeks, Ethan focused on rebuilding Emma's trust. He showed up for her in small but meaningful ways, offering to help with her shifts at the diner, spending time with her family, and most importantly, being honest about everything. Slowly, Emma began to let her guard down. But Ethan knew there was one more thing he needed to do before he could truly ask for her forgiveness. He needed to make her see that he was committed to building a future with her, one based on love, trust, and honesty. He just needed the perfect moment. Winter was settling into the city, casting a light frost over the streets and painting the trees in the park with delicate crystals. Ethan had spent the last several weeks carefully rebuilding his relationship with Emma. Slowly but surely, her walls were coming down. There were moments of laughter, shared meals, and even the occasional stolen glance that hinted at the love they once had. But he knew it wasn't enough yet. Emma was cautious, and he didn't blame her. Trust wasn't something you could demand, it had to be earned. Ethan wanted to show her not just with words or gestures, but with his actions that he was ready to start over on her terms. So he planned something that would reflect who they truly were, not the billionaire and the humble waitress, but just Ethan and Emma. One snowy evening, Ethan called Emma and asked her to meet him at the diner where they had first met. The place was quiet, with only a handful of regulars scattered at the booths. The faint hum of a jukebox in the corner added to the cozy atmosphere. Ethan had spoken with the owner earlier in the day to reserve their usual table by the window, where they had shared countless conversations over coffee and pie. Emma arrived bundled in her coat, her cheeks pink from the cold, her auburn hair spilled out from beneath a knitted beanie. And despite everything, Ethan thought she looked as radiant as the first day he saw her. "Hi," she said softly, her eyes meeting his as she slid into the booth across from him. "Hi," Ethan replied, a nervous smile tugging at his lips. The waitress brought them 2 cups of coffee, black for Ethan, cream and sugar for Emma. For a while, they just talked. No grand declarations, no heavy conversations. They reminisced about the night they met, how Ethan had spilled his coffee because he was too busy watching her, and how she'd teased him for being a lousy flirt. But as the conversation lulled, Ethan took a deep breath. This was the moment. "Emma," he began, reaching for her hand across the table. She didn't pull away. "I know I've made mistakes, big ones," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "I hurt you because I didn't trust you, but these past few weeks you've shown me something I never thought I'd have. You've shown me that love doesn't need tests, conditions, or games. It just needs honesty." Emma's eyes softened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan wasn't finished. He stood and moved to her side of the booth, dropping to one knee on the diner's scuffed linoleum floor. Emma's eyes widened. "Ethan," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple velvet box. Inside was a ring, not ostentatious or flashy, but a delicate gold band with a small diamond, elegant and understated. "This isn't about fixing things with money or trying to make you forget what I did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is about building something new, something real with no lies, no doubts, just us." Tears shimmered in Emma's eyes as she stared at him, her hands trembling. "Emma Monroe, will you marry me? I know I don't deserve your forgiveness yet, but I promise to spend the rest of my life earning it, to be the man you deserve, to love you the way you've always deserved to be loved." For a moment the diner fell silent. The waitress paused mid-step, the cook peeked out from the kitchen, and even the regulars put down their coffee cups. Emma looked at Ethan, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand on his cheek. "You've hurt me, Ethan," she said softly, "and it's going to take time for me to trust you again. But I've seen the man you're trying to become. I've seen your heart." Ethan's breath caught. "And yes," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek, "I'll marry you." The diner erupted in cheers and applause. The waitress wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, and one of the regulars slapped the counter and shouted, "About time!" Ethan slid the ring onto Emma's finger, his hands shaking as he realized he had just been given a second chance, a chance he wouldn't squander. The wedding was simple, just as Emma had always wanted. It took place in the backyard of the house Ethan had bought for her parents, with snow blanketing the ground like a scene from a winter fairy tale. Emma's parents were overjoyed, their dream home serving as the perfect setting for the celebration. Friends and family gathered under a canopy of twinkling lights. Emma wore a vintage lace gown, and Ethan traded his designer suits for a modest navy tuxedo. As they exchanged vows, Ethan made one promise above all others, to always choose honesty and trust, no matter what. When the ceremony ended, the couple shared their first dance on the porch, while Emma's siblings played a cheerful tune on an old guitar. Laughter, warmth, and love filled the air. Ethan had spent much of his life surrounded by wealth, power, and people who only cared about the surface. But in that moment, holding Emma in his arms, he realized he had found the one thing money could never buy: a love built on truth, sacrifice, and genuine connection. As they danced under the soft glow of the lights, Ethan whispered into Emma's ear, "You were right. Love isn't a game, it's trust, and I'm so grateful you gave me the chance to earn yours again." Emma smiled, leaning her head against his chest. and I'm grateful you finally let me love you for who you really are. Together, they stepped into a new chapter of their lives, ready to face whatever challenges came their way, together. The real wealth, Ethan realized, wasn't in his bank account. It was in the woman standing by his side.